It felt bad when my mom said, "It's embarrassing that Shirley is just a high school graduate. She's so different from Laura," with a tone that showed she wasn't proud. My dad agreed, nodding and saying, "Yes, yes." My sister, Laura, sat beside them and smiled proudly, knowing they were praising her. I'm Shirley, a high school graduate working as a fashion designer. My sister, Laura, is attending a prestigious university. My parents proudly call her elite because of her hard work. But why is there such a big difference between us? Let me tell you my story. I'm 27 years old and grew up in a small town in the countryside. I lived there with my grandparents, parents, and Laura, who is 8 years younger than me. Laura was the center of attention in our family. She was adored, and her wishes always came first, while I got used to being overlooked. Our parents treated us very differently. For example, Laura would get fancy toys for her birthday, but my birthday gift was often combined with Christmas, and it was usually just one thing, like a book or something educational, not very exciting for a kid. When Laura joined the soccer team, our parents went to her practices and games every week. I was in the tennis club in middle school, but even on the day of my final match, my parents didn't come because they had to take Laura to her practice instead. This is how things always were. Laura came first. Sometimes I wanted to cry, but the one who always cheered me up was Laura. When our parents compared us, she would say, "That's not true. My sister is smart too. She helps me with my studies, and she's amazing." A few days after my last tennis match, she made me a small bouquet from flowers she picked in the park and gave it to me, saying, "Well done." Laura grew up with a kind heart. My grandparents, who lived with us, often scolded my parents for their unfair behavior and stood up for me. Before I graduated from high school, my grandmother passed away. A few days later, my grandfather also passed away. Laura always stood by me, but this seemed to annoy our mother. She started treating Laura more harshly, even threatening her, saying, "If you keep defending your sister, I'll make you stand outside." It was a cold winter, and snow had started to fall. I didn't want Laura to go through such harsh treatment, so I told her, "You don't have to worry about me anymore." After that, Laura stopped defending me and focused on her studies and sports. She started living peacefully under our parents' roof. The loss of our grandparents also affected our parents. They said they had no savings and quickly dismissed my wish to go to university. I wanted to study design, but they didn't support me. After finishing high school, I had no choice but to find a job. Still, I didn't give up on my dream of working in design. I moved out and joined a company that made a small fashion magazine. My job was mainly office work, but I persuaded my boss to let me help the designers. Working in an office surrounded by professional designers every day opened my eyes to the reality of the industry. Instead of discouraging me, it made me even more determined. My dream of becoming a fashion designer grew stronger, and I spent all my free time studying. I rarely went home, and when I did, my parents greeted me with cold words. So, I focused on learning design on weekends through online courses and other resources. Because of my hard work, my company noticed my dedication, and I was finally invited to join the design team. My passion for my work inspired the other designers, and they generously shared helpful materials and connections with me. 4 years later, I was working on my own projects as a full-fledged fashion designer. 9 years after high school, I had settled into my career when I heard that Laura was preparing for her university entrance exams. She was aiming for a prestigious medical school. Laura worked hard every day and had top grades in our town, so her acceptance was almost certain. Remembering how she had supported me when we were younger, I wanted to help her however I could. A few months later, Laura was successfully admitted to a famous medical university. When I heard that Laura got accepted, I was really happy and immediately said, "Laura, congratulations. You worked so hard, going to cram school every day. That's amazing." Laura thanked me humbly, but then shared a concern. She said, "Actually, the medical school asks for a donation. It's not mandatory, but Mom and Dad think it would be embarrassing if someone from the countryside didn't pay it. They said we should pay, but you know our finances are already tight with my tuition and living expenses." Laura even offered to manage her living costs by working part-time, but it was clear she wouldn't have time for a job because medical school would demand all her focus. A donation wasn't required, but with our dad working a regular office job and mom only working part-time twice a week, just paying the tuition was already a big challenge. I started to think they might be counting on my savings, but felt disappointed they didn't ask me directly, and instead made Laura bring it up. Even though I felt let down, I decided to help Laura. I agreed to cover the donation and any other costs she needed to start school. Laura rented an apartment near the university, which wasn't far from where I lived. I was ready to help her whenever she needed. But as time passed, Laura seemed to enjoy her university life and became distant. When I reached out, her responses were short and indifferent. Even though she didn't seem interested in talking, she often sent requests like, "I want to eat this," or "Please send me that." I reluctantly arranged deliveries and lent her money, covering the expenses our parents couldn't manage. We occasionally met for meals, but Laura was cold during those times too. She was glued to her phone, only looking up to eat, and whenever I tried to start a conversation, she'd just say, "I'm busy with studies." We barely talked about anything meaningful. Her attitude left me feeling more confused every time. When did we start drifting apart like this? Today, during another meal, she seemed like she didn't want to be there, judging by her reactions. Trying to lighten the mood, I brought up a casual topic about home and said, "Well, as long as you're doing well, that's probably enough to make mom and dad happy, right?" Laura suddenly looked at me, smirked coldly, and said, "Of course. I'm a famous medical student, and you're just a high school graduate designer. Mom and dad aren't worried about you because your job doesn't even need any qualifications," Laura said. Her harsh words hurt me deeply. "What do you mean it doesn't need qualifications?" I asked. "Exactly what I said," she replied coldly. "You call yourself a designer, but anyone can do that nowadays by just looking stuff up online. Even my friends can make websites easily. Aren't you embarrassed to do such a job? Maybe you should at least get a certification." "Oh, but that might be hard for a high school graduate." I felt crushed. "I've worked hard to get where I am. How can you say such things about me, Laura? What happened to you?" Laura just glared at me, annoyed, and clicked her tongue. "Mom and dad talk about it every day. They say I'm amazing for getting into a prestigious medical school, but they're embarrassed that their eldest daughter is just a high school grad. They even tell me I should take care of you so you don't get jealous. That's why I bother contacting you or eating with you, because they told me to." Her words brought back painful memories from when we were kids. Our parents had always compared us, saying things like, "Laura is smart and reliable, but Shirley is clumsy, stupid, and useless." Hearing that again now felt like a knife to my heart. I felt dizzy and suffocated. Lowering my head, I tried to hold back tears. Laura, thinking I was crying, snorted and said, "Well, I'll be going now." She quickly left the table and went home. Since starting her new life at university, Laura had become a completely different person. All the praise from our parents, constantly calling her a genius and saying she would be a great doctor, seemed to have inflated her ego. At the same time, their belittling remarks about me must have influenced her attitude even more. By the end of that year, I got a raise at work and planned to celebrate with a dinner at a local restaurant. When I told our parents, they said, "Bring Laura home with you," so I reluctantly agreed. It had been a while since Laura had come home because she was busy with her studies and training. From the moment she arrived, our parents barely paid any attention to me. They focused entirely on her. That evening, they invited neighbors, relatives, and even Laura's old classmates who still lived in the area. They prepared a big party with pizzas, a barbecue in the garden, and a lavish spread of food. It was all for Laura, not for me or my accomplishment. I was about to take the microphone to explain the real reason for the party when my mom grabbed it and said, "Today, we are here to announce that Laura has been accepted into medical school and will become a respectable doctor in the future." This party was supposed to celebrate my promotion, but my mom's words shocked me. I tried to speak up, but my dad stopped me. Then Laura, encouraged by the attention, started boasting in front of everyone. "My mom wants me to come home more often, but I'm studying at a prestigious private university, and it's not easy, especially in the medical department. In medical school, we have to work as a team, not just individually, so if I come home, it causes trouble for others. Everyone relies on me when they don't understand something. It's a bit overwhelming. I quietly slipped into the kitchen, pretending to prepare some stew, but I could still hear her loud words. While it wasn't surprising that our parents and relatives were praising Laura, her constant bragging must have been uncomfortable for the neighbors and her former classmates. As Laura kept talking, one neighbor, tired of listening, started a conversation with me when I brought out some drinks. "By the way, Shirley, you're working hard in design, aren't you?" Before I could respond, Laura and our parents quickly interrupted. "She's trying, sort of," they said, shaking their heads. But not much can be expected. It's embarrassing that Shirley is just a high school graduate. "She's so different from Laura," my mom added with a hint of disdain. My dad nodded in agreement, saying, "Yes, yes," while Laura smiled proudly, knowing they were praising her. In the room, there were many people who had only finished high school and were working hard, as well as parents with children in similar situations. While food and drinks were served, everyone tried to stay polite, but it was clear they felt uncomfortable. The only ones who seemed unaware of the awkwardness were my parents and Laura. Feeling overwhelmed by the unpleasant atmosphere, I tried to leave quietly without saying anything. But Laura stopped me. "You come home pretty often, don't you?" "I come back with confidence because I study hard every day." "But maybe you don't mind because you lack both academic credentials and pride," she said, laughing loudly. Even though my dad said, "Hey, that's not a nice thing to say," he laughed a little too. Her words left me speechless and filled with anger. "Good for you, Laura. You don't have to worry. I won't come back next year," I said with a trembling voice as people around us watched with concern. I put down my tray, grabbed my coat and bag, and got ready to leave. Laura and the others were grinning and sharing looks. "If that's what you want, I'll do as you say." "I'll never come back," I said. Even though I was boiling with anger inside, my voice came out cold and emotionless. I didn't feel anything for my parents or Laura anymore. When I said those words, they cheerfully waved and said, "Don't ever come back." As I walked to the bus station, I fought the urge to scream. Going back home had always been painful. When I was chasing my dream of becoming a fashion designer, I rarely visited, using my studies as an excuse. But as I became more established in my career, I still felt tied to my parents, no matter how hard I tried to move on. Laura is much younger and still a student, so maybe she doesn't understand the struggles I've faced since joining the workforce. But my parents should. They raised 3 kids, and while they must have worked hard to do that, they always treated Laura like a genius because of her academic success. They praised her endlessly while belittling me. Their words still stung, not just with anger, but with deep disappointment that squeezed my heart. If I truly valued my work and self-respect, I couldn't keep this toxic relationship, even if they were family. Laura's cruel behavior that night made me decide to completely cut ties with my parents. Months passed, and as the new school year approached, I suddenly got a call from Laura. She hadn't contacted me since that night. She also sent several messages saying, "Please answer the phone." Reluctantly, I picked up. "Hey, what about my tuition?" she asked, her voice full of fear and urgency. I calmly replied, "I already paid the admission fee, the donation, and your first year of tuition." "No, I mean the tuition for the second year. The university is telling me to pay it quickly because it hasn't been paid yet." I was stunned. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. On the other end of the line, Laura hesitated, unable to respond. The truth was, I had used up most of my savings to cover her expensive tuition for the first year. I had planned to make payments gradually for the following years. But after the way she and my family had treated me, I was shocked that she would call me now, expecting me to pay again. "You asked me to help with the donation, didn't you?" "I only helped with the tuition because I was being overly generous." "Didn't Mom and Dad send you to a private university because they could afford the tuition? Or did you apply without thinking about the costs?" I asked. "That's not true," Laura replied, "but living expenses and travel costs are really hard." A lot of my classmates are wealthy, and I have to keep up with social obligations too. My parents helped with that, but they said they couldn't afford the tuition and told me to ask you. The reason I could afford to help earlier was that I'd switched to a major design firm to advance my career as a fashion designer. With my success, my salary had gone up significantly, and because I was so busy with work, I'd saved a lot of money from my salary and bonuses. I had told my parents about my job change, so they probably assumed from the start that I'd help pay Laura's tuition. On top of that, they likely thought I'd keep helping because I'd already covered the donation. It seemed like the money I'd saved for her was now gone, wasted on unnecessary expenses. But I no longer felt forgiving toward Laura. While I could have easily covered the tuition, I decided to refuse her request. A few days later, when my parents called me, I rejected their plea too. Their voices sounded panicked and accusatory, which only made me feel worse. In that moment, I realized I could never go back home. They didn't see me as family, they only saw me as someone they could take money from. I wasn't going to let them drain my savings without any care for my feelings. Laura started calling me almost every day, crying. If there had been even one sincere apology, I might have reconsidered. But her words were always the same: please pay for my tuition. If this keeps up, I'll be expelled. I'm doing my best with scholarships and part-time jobs, but it's not enough. What will people think if a student as excellent as me gets expelled? I'll pay you back when I become a doctor. We're family, please help me. Even her voicemail messages were all similar. One message shocked me: if you're worried about not being able to come home, I'll tell them you don't have to. After saving the messages as proof, I deleted them from my phone. Then I sent a final message to Laura and blocked her number completely. I thought to myself, people who look down on others shouldn't become doctors. And with that, I cut ties completely. I cut off contact with my family and welcomed a new spring. A relative told me that Laura's second-year tuition was eventually paid through scholarships and loans from different relatives. However, there was no extra money to cover her living expenses, so she had to work part-time. Balancing work with her heavy studies, frequent exams, and medical school practices was harder than she expected. She failed many classes and had to drop out 7 months later. Before cutting ties with my family, I had been helping not only with Laura's tuition, but also by sending money home. After I stopped, Laura, whose pride was shattered, returned to live with our struggling parents, who were barely making ends meet. Even though Laura was smart, the money for her education had run out. Instead of looking for a job locally, she spent her time playing games and taking out her anger and frustration on others. A neighbor told me that loud arguments could often be heard from their house at night. Since my parents had always spoiled Laura, they couldn't stand up to her. When I saw my parents around the neighborhood, they looked tired and people avoided talking to them. One day, under what must have been extreme stress, my father got into trouble on the train during his commute. He inappropriately touched a woman standing next to him, and other passengers noticed. He was detained and arrested. Fortunately, a settlement was reached, and it didn't turn into a criminal case, but my father was forced to resign from his job. My mother started looking for work, but since she had only worked part-time before, she couldn't find a stable job. My parents tried to contact me through relatives, but it didn't go well. The messages they asked others to pass on were reportedly threatening, which made the relatives realize there were issues with my parents. They told my parents, "Leave it to us," but eventually stopped passing on messages altogether. Over time, my connection with my family faded, and I finally found peace in my daily life. From what I've heard from relatives, Laura has become a recluse, and my unemployed father, who now looks frightening, is avoided by people in the neighborhood. Bad rumors about them have spread. My mother, overwhelmed by everything, has disappeared, and no one can contact her anymore. Now, my father and Laura are left without any source of income and are reportedly living almost like homeless people. If they had built good relationships with their neighbors, they might have found some support. But given their behavior in the past, it's hard for anyone to sympathize with them. I'm doing well in my design career and recently got chosen to work on big projects, which is a big step forward for me. This has inspired me to finally start a plan I've been thinking about for a while, taking university entrance exams. Since my finances are in a good place now, I plan to focus on this challenge after finishing my current project. Looking ahead, I'm also thinking about starting my own business. To prepare for that, I want to learn more, not just about design, but also about management. I'm really excited about this new challenge.